Hey guys, it's Mr. Schmidt here, and in this video, we're going to look at topic 2.2 supply, which would be textbook pages 60 to 66. And so the good news here is that a lot of what you've learned with demand is going to work here with supply. You're going to see that a lot of the terminology is pretty similar, except this time we're going to be looking at sellers instead of looking at buyers and what they're doing. And so that's basically what we're trying to do in this section. So individual supply, much like individual demand, is the different quantities of a good or service that one seller is willing and able to sell at different prices. Remember, willing means that the seller is wants to sell the product. Able means they have the resources, they have the financing to be able to sell that product. On the other hand, market supply is the different quantities of a good or service that all sellers are willing and able to sell at different prices. So while market supply is the sum of every seller's individual supply, individual supply is looking at just one seller. And again, it's important we distinguish between market supply and individual supply, with market supply being all those individual sellers, what they want to sell and able to sell, added up together. So just make sure we understand that difference. Now, the law of supply basically says that if the price of a good increases, the quantity supplied increases. In other words, if the seller can get a higher price for their product, they're going to want to sell more of it. And this word price, you do need to be careful with it because sometimes students think that the word price here means the cost to produce the good, and that's not what I'm talking about. The price here means the price to sell it, right? What price can the seller or the producer get for that good or service? So just be careful with what we mean by price. Quantity supplied, much like quantity demanded, is a specific quantity a producer or producers, another word for sellers, are willing and able to sell at a specific price. So, for example, two shirts at a price of $10 per shirt, right? Specific price, specific quantity, right? So, while supply would be the entirety of all the quantity supplied is one specific point on the supply curve, and you'll see that momentarily. So, a practice question for you, and then you can kind of pause and see if you can figure this out, and we'll talk about it. How does price serve as a signal to producers of a good or service? So, pause the video, give it a try. We'll see what you come up with. So, the correct answer, or I guess there's several answers you could give here, but the one I'm going to go with to talk about is price tells the seller how much the consumer values the good or service. Price is a measure of quality, it's a measure of value, and so we talked about in Unit 1 in market economies how much price plays a role in determining outcomes in that type of economic system. So with that out of the way, let's talk about just drawing the supply curve. You're going to notice here that it is upward sloping because as the price is higher, people want to sell more of the product, and at lower prices, people want to sell less. Again, upward sloping. I guess the one thing I would just say here is just make sure we've got the labels, for the axes as well as the curve. It's one of those things that's so easy for students to forget because they focus so much on making sure they can draw it correctly. The labels also matter, so make sure you have those too. And then, of course, one specific point on the supply curve, just like with demand, is a quantity supplied. A specific quantity people are willing and able to buy at a specific price. So if the price of a good changes, this can be shown by moving along the supply curve from one quantity supplied to another. So this works just like it did with demand. So if you look at the graph here, if I want to go from point A to point B to show a price increase, I can just move along the curve from A to B, and I don't have to shift the curve, right? However, I do want to spend the rest of this video talking about moving or shifting the supply curve. So when the supply curve shifts to the left, this means sellers are willing and able to sell less of the good regardless of the price. So once again, left means less. So this is something that it's a good thing to remember when moving the curves. So what we see here, supply moving to the left. This is one of those where the arrow and how you draw the arrow really makes a difference, because if you angle the arrow here and you make it point up, it looks like supply is moving up the axis, which makes you think more supply, which is not the case. So make sure your arrows are pointing left and right, and then you won't have that issue. And of course, labeling the new supply curve something different. And then, of course, the other case, when the supply curve shifts to the right, this means sellers are willing and able to sell more of the good regardless of the price. So right means more, left means less. And of course, this would be how you would draw it. Again, making sure the arrow is pointing to the right and not angling it, particularly down, which would make it look like supply is moving down or less. Not something we want to do. So make sure left is less, right is more. Finally, before we do some practice at the end, I do want to talk about what can move the supply curve. And of course, this is not necessarily an exhaustive list. This is simply probably the four that AP asks about the most. So first is the number of sellers. Less sellers would move supply to the left. More sellers would move supply to the right. Second one, technology and productivity. So if workers are less productive or there's less technology available to them, supply moves to the left. If there is more technology or productivity, supply would move to the right. So with that in mind, let's do a practice here. So show what happens to the market supply for apples if a new apple picking technology is invented. So pause the video, draw it out, see what you come up with. The correct answer here would be a supply shift to the right. So this would be more technology, which would move supply to the right. Make sure you have that arrow. And then the third one, this is probably the one of the four that students get tripped up with the most, which is input prices or resource prices. So in other words, if it's more expensive to make the product, supply to the left. If it's cheaper to make the product, supply to the right. I think that's probably the best way to talk about it. It just says, how much does it cost to make the product, right? A cheaper product, sellers want to sell more of that. The more expensive it is to make, the harder it is for them to sell it or want to sell it. And then finally, before we get to the last one, we do need to define this word subsidy. This is money given to a firm or business to encourage production. You see this a lot in agriculture to encourage the production of crops that a country is not producing in sufficient quantities to encourage production. So if the government adds a subsidy, that would move supply to the right. If the government removes the subsidy, that would move supply to the left. Finally, let's do one more practice question. So show what happens to the market supply for apples if apple pickers successfully negotiate higher wages. Again, you know the drill. Pause the video, see what you get. So this one is going to be supply to the left. So the way to think about this is the wage is basically the price of labor, which is a resource. So if the workers are more expensive because you have to pay them more, then you can't make as much of the product. So that would be supply to the left. So that's all for this video on supply. Until next time, have a great day.